going to get back into our presentations now. Our next speaker, she comes to us from Washington, D.C., and today she's representing the Secular Coalition of America, and she's going to tell us why science is under attack. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Diana Castillo.
All right, thanks, Mason, for introducing me. Hi, I'm Diana Castillo. I am the now former state chapter coordinator for the Secular Coalition, now legislative manager. So during my time as state chapter coordinator, I was in charge of working with all of our volunteers on the ground in states all around the country, trying to form chapters to do what we were doing in DC, which is represent non-theists, free thinkers, secularists, humanists who are living in these states and making sure that they have a voice in the legislative process. And one of the things I was doing day after day was looking at legislation from different states, seeing what was being introduced in Montana versus what was being introduced in Florida, what was being introduced in Arkansas. And so while I was looking at that, a lot of themes just kept showing up. Things like new Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, which are being used as a license to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. Things like trying to honor Day of Prayer. And unfortunately, one of the things that kept popping up was ways to undermine science and science education. So, as you're all aware, science and religion have had kind of a contentious history, and so this ranges from the current debates about vaccines and what's the proper place for vaccines. Personally, I am pro getting rid of all of the exemptions. That's something that we are very strong advocates for. But you're seeing this questioning of science and scientific consensus, and part of it is because we're starting it in the classroom. And so what we're seeing now in the science classroom, we're going to be talking a little bit more about this in my speech as it goes on, but you're having these legislators try to insert religion into the public school science classroom, saying that, oh, we're teaching the controversy, we're showing all sides. But what it actually is doing is undermining teachers' attempts to teach their students about the world that they live in, about evolution, about climate change, about things that they need to function in the modern world. And it's going to be coming to a crisis at some point in the near future. And it's something that I think folks need to be, I'm sure you all are aware of it, but it's something we need to be really cognizant about and start taking a stronger stand on. So I'm going to be covering a few things in my speech today. One is, of course, evolution and the attempts to insert creationism into public science classrooms. I think we're all fairly aware that this is probably one of the most contentious debates in teaching science in modern day public schools. The next is talking about climate change and why that has become tied with evolution as one of the more contentious points in science education today. And finally, looking at a new avenue that the religious right is using to undermine science education, which are these student religious liberty acts. I'm going to close out by looking at the different states around Arkansas and seeing where they stand right now with their science education and what's being done to undermine it, and also talking about what you guys can do to take action, because I don't want you guys to leave this talk feeling depressed about, oh, well, science is under attack, what can you do? I want to make sure that you guys know that there are options to bolster science education and make sure that your voices are being heard and that your public school classrooms are being used correctly to teach kids science and not teaching them religion or religious dogma. So we have the evolution of creationist attacks against science education, or against evolution. So probably the first one that most folks are aware about and the most famous is the Scopes monkey trial. So I included it, even though most folks are really aware of it, just because I really love the name. It's such a great name. So some background on this. With Scopes, and I think I got the date wrong on that, I'm sorry. So with Scopes, it happened in a post-World War I environment where you're starting to see a schism between a lot of the Protestant churches in the United States, where you had the more modernist viewpoint, which is, yes, you can reconcile science, specifically evolution, with religion. We've already reconciled things like modern geology, modern astronomy with our religion. Why can't we reconcile evolution and the origin of the species with our faith? And then you had a more fundamentalist viewpoint, which is, no, science is wrong, it's from the devil, it's misleading, everything we need is in the Bible. So in this climate, Tennessee passed a law that prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. And so the ACLU, much like they do today, decided to try and find a test case, trying to find someone who would be willing to challenge the ban. The ACLU would cover all the costs, represent them for free. And so substitute teacher Scopes volunteered to be the test case. And fairly famous trial had big names on both sides, including one of the biggest names in fundamentalist churches, William Jennings Bryan, who failed to become president multiple times. He had the famous "I will hang on this cross of gold," and Charles Darrow. And Scopes ended up being convicted, although it was overturned on a technicality, leaving the ban on teaching evolution in place. And that ban wasn't fully overturned until a case later on, which I'm going to talk about because it is relevant to Arkansas. The next case you have that's one that that's relevant is Daniel v. Waters, which a U.S. Court of Appeals strikes down a Tennessee law mandating equal time. So after the Supreme Court ruled that banning evolution was unconstitutional, but it violated the Establishment Clause, states try to get around this by saying, okay, look, if we can't outright ban evolution, we're just going to make sure it has equal time. So, the kids are still getting their Bible study, and the kids are still learning that evolution isn't the only thing that's out there. So Daniel v. Waters comes around, and the district court rules that, no, this is actually unconstitutional, guys. You need to stop. 2 years later, this ruling gives us a line that's going to become problematic later on. The specific quote was, any biology textbook used for the teaching of public schools which expresses an opinion or relates to a theory about the origins or creation of man. Oh, sorry, that's the quote from the law. So after this creation, I'm sorry, it's been a really long weekend so far, so I'm very sorry. So after this, creationism was rebranded under creation science. And this is the first of many rebrandings that creationism has had since it really started to become this contentious public debate. And so the creationists thought, well, maybe if we label it science, it will actually be science, right? Because, naming gives you ownership. So that didn't work. And Hendren versus Campbell, this is a state case, they ruled that creationist textbook can't be used in public schools because it violates the Establishment Clause, setting the case for Edwards v. Aguillard. So this was, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a Louisiana law requiring creationism be taught whenever evolution was taught was unconstitutional. And unfortunately, this ruling gave us some language which the creationists seize on in the modern day. We do not imply that a legislature could never require that scientific critiques of prevailing scientific theories be taught. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origins of humankind to school children might be validly done with the clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science instruction. So that sets the stage for later on with the Louisiana Science Education Act. So what this case does, well, it says that requiring creationism being taught is unconstitutional. It left an opening for, well, science is made of theories, and theories aren't facts, forgetting that while that is the case in most usages of the word theory, with science, theory is used differently. It's used to talk about something that explains a natural law, so like the laws of gravity. Newton's laws of motion. Theories in science are used to explain those natural laws, and that's something that's really hard to communicate to folks because theory in most other cases means that it's an educated guess. more or less. So the next big case that comes up with the teaching of creationism is Weber v. New Lenox School District. And so this came up when a social studies teacher sued his school district, saying that the school district had infringed on his right to free speech by firing him for by punishing him for teaching creationism. And he said, look, I'm just expressing myself. This is an infringement on my First Amendment rights. And so what the Supreme Court said, that it didn't actually violate someone's free speech if a school punished them for, or took action against them for teaching creationism. They said that the teaching of creation science was religious advocacy. And so that's one of the big things that the Supreme Court said in all of these cases, was that teaching creationism isn't just presenting another side of the story. It isn't just saying, oh, well, evolution's just one theory on how we came to walk on two legs and have pets and live in houses, but you know, God also created us in 6 days and took the seventh day as a rest, which is why we have Sunday. No, that teaching creationism or creation science was in fact religious advocacy, was in fact a clear violation of the Establishment Clause. And so that shifted the language and messaging that these groups were using from creationism or creation science to intelligent design. And so under intelligent design, they were trying to get more and more states and more school districts to adopt these policies that when teaching evolution, they also had to give credence to the fact that there might be someone out there who thought the human form, the human shape was a really good thing, and, you know, set them on the path for that. So we have Kitzmiller versus Dover, which took place in Pennsylvania, where a school district said, hey, you know what, in clear violation of the Pennsylvania state standards, you're going to have to talk about intelligent design in the science classrooms. And the science teachers revolted. They said, no, we aren't reading this statement. This is a violation of the state standards. A school administrator had to be the one who read this. In the next school board election, the school board members who had put forward this proposal, all young Earth creationists, were voted out of office, which shows how unpopular this entire thing was. So in this, the school district ruled that intelligent design is in fact not science and can't be taught in schools. So what does that leave these young Earth creationists? They can't call it creationism, can't call it creation science, can't call it intelligent design. Well, let's go back to Edwards v. Aguilar, where it's like, well, in a secular context, if you're talking about theories and looking at all sides, that's the way we can do it. And that's how organizations like the Discovery Institute, which is based out of Washington State, are trying to attack science education and science standards now. So 3 years after Kitzmiller v. Dover, we have the Louisiana Science Education Act. Signed by Bobby Jindal, this allows for teachers to use supplemental materials in science classrooms that are critical of evolution and climate change. There have been multiple attempts to repeal this piece of legislation because a lot of people realize this is not in the best interest of the students. This isn't in the best interest of making sure that Louisiana has a competitive economy that it's able to have its students advance in the work in higher education. Unfortunately, from 2011 to 2014, attempts to repeal have failed, and it's looking like it's not going to happen again this year. This law is being used as a model for laws all around the country, pushed forward by the Discovery Institute, which I had mentioned earlier. Their language, their messaging about this is that these laws promote critical thinking. It's encouraging the students to question these theories, these accepted theories, because, you know, there's controversy behind them. But what it's actually doing, and, you know, we're a skeptical audience, we encourage legitimate critical thinking and questioning the world around us, but it comes to a point where just constantly questioning and constantly trying to find loopholes undermines the entire process of being skeptical, of looking at the world around you and thinking about it critically. And that's what's going to be happening to these students if we start seeing these laws passed en masse. It's going to become another situation like with the anti-vax movements, where even if you have study after study after study showing that, evolution is something that exists, that evolution is this accepted scientific fact for 99.9% of the scientific community, you're still going to have those who are like, oh no, but there's this other person who says this, even though they don't actually have legitimate sources. So, Arkansas. And for those of you who I was talking with last night, you probably realized that I am a huge Star Wars fan, so when I found this photo, I felt like I had to include it, just also because it adds a bit of levity to it. So in Arkansas, when they banned evolution, they didn't take the route that Tennessee did, which was have the legislature be the one to introduce the law, to pass the law, have the governor sign it into law. No, they passed it by general initiative. Someone got it on the ballot and said, hey, look, we need to ban teaching evolution. This is bad for our children. And so it passed. And so it remained on the books for 40 years until Epperson v. Arkansas. And this was the case I had mentioned earlier, which was the case that overturned banning teaching evolution. In this case, Justice Fortis cited the laws designed to protect a particular religious view and therefore violated the First Amendment. This law, because it came from the Supreme Court, struck down other laws that were still in the books. I believe still in Tennessee and other parts of the South that had banned teaching evolution. So that's what brought us into, well, they have to give equal time to evolution and creationism because we can't just say you can't teach evolution anymore. So then in 1981, you have Arkansas Act 590, which is the Balanced Treatment for Creation Science and Evolution Science Act. So under this rebranding, creationism, instead of being biblical, is now an actual science. And so it's proper to be taught in science classrooms. This law was overturned in McLean v. Arkansas. The U.S. District Court said that creation science was simply not science, citing the unfalsibility of creationism, and therefore teaching it violated the Establishment Clause. And so in all of these cases, they're talking about how creationism comes from one specific religious viewpoint. It isn't a universal thing, no matter what the religious right are trying to tell us, because different religions have their different origin stories. They have their different stories on how the world came to be, how we came to be. And by teaching creationism, you're focusing on one to the exclusion of others. Unfortunately, in Arkansas, in a survey done by the NCSE, which is the National Center for Science Education, 50% of teachers right now, at least in 2005, which was the last survey they did, don't teach evolution for fear of losing their jobs, because evolution is still seen as this controversial topic and is something that needs to be avoided. Other forms of they were afraid of other forms of intimidation, or they just simply saw no need to teach evolution. 10% do actually teach creationism in the science classrooms. Another 20% try to teach evolution but aren't properly trained. They don't have the resources to properly teach their students about evolution and about how humans and other species came to be. So that leaves only 20% of teachers who are able to adequately teach evolution in public science classrooms, which is kind of an abysmal number when you think about it. The next thing that has become closely tied with evolution lately has been teaching of climate change. And now the word climate change itself has already been brought about because of the war on words. it was global warming for a number of years, but then scientists who worked for oil companies, who worked for politicians who were being paid by the oil companies, said, no, global warming is too alarming. We need to use climate change. And so climate change does unbeknownst to them, more adequately describes what's been happening in the world due to man-made pollution, man-made causes of climate change. But lately, climate change and evolution have become slowly tied together, so much so that the National Center for Science Education, which was founded to help promote the teaching of evolution, to help protect science teachers, recently added climate change to their list of issues. It is now routine for evolution and climate change to be targeted together in attacks on science education in the United States. This is from the National Center for Science Education's Deputy Director, Glenn Branch. Citing laws in Tennessee, Louisiana, recent bills in Colorado, Arizona, Kansas, Montana, and Oklahoma, the Texas state science standards, and recent resistance to adopting the next generation science standards in Kentucky. Even in the absence of organized opposition to the teaching of evolution, he added, the situation in K-12 classrooms is famously dire, citing survey results about the teaching of evolution and climate change. And so there are a lot of different theories about why, in recent years, the teaching of climate change has become so controversial and has become tied in with the teaching of evolution as something that needs to be opposed by religious groups as, climate change isn't real because if God wanted to end the earth, he'd end the earth instead of just having this slow march with climate change. New research by Yale's Dan Cahan reaffirms that there's something going on. He showed that there is a correlation of 2.5, which is weak to modest but significant, between a person's religiosity and his or her tendency to think that global warming isn't much of a risk. Perhaps even more tellingly, Cahan also found that among highly religious individuals, as their ability to comprehend science increases, so does their denial of the risk posed by climate change. And so this is something that's becoming more and more of a problem, specifically when politicians are using religion to justify the fact that they are trying to undermine the teaching of climate change. These are all quotes from folks in Congress, so you can see the Secular Coalition has its work cut out for us right now in DC. From Representative Jeff Miller, he's from Florida, who has a lot to lose by rising sea levels, am I right? The scientific community is not unanimous on climate change, and our climate will continue to change because of the way God formed the earth, and that was back in 2012. Rep. John Schminkus from Illinois read the Bible in a committee hearing to prove that climate change will not in fact destroy the earth. The earth will only end when God declares its time over. Man will not destroy this earth. This earth will not be destroyed by the flood. Senator Inhofe, I'm butchering his name, from Oklahoma, the guy who had the snowball on the Senate floor, which, by the way, does anyone know what happened to that snowball after he used it as a prop? I'm still trying to figure that out. Because I feel sorry for whoever had to, if he just left it there, I feel sorry for whoever had to clean it up. They have a lot to deal with, guys. Yeah. He also has frequently cited the Bible as to talk about how climate change isn't real. And Arkansas politicians aren't immune from this, although from digging around, it doesn't look like they've cited the Bible as their colleagues have, but they have shown that they're willing to question climate change as being scientific fact. Senator John Boozman said, I think we got perhaps climate change going on. The question is what's causing it. Is man causing it? Is this a cycle that happens throughout the years, throughout the ages? More recently, he said, now, I'm not a scientist, but I'm an optometrist. And I spent much of my life working with the scientific community. I was a zoology major. And I've said before that there's nothing scientific about discrediting people who present conflicting evidence and ask reasonable questions. Now, there is nothing wrong about that, but like I've said before, it becomes problematic when there's so much of the scientific community looking at different sets of data and coming to the same conclusions, unless, they're being paid to find something different. But it's becoming more and more problematic when the politicians are trying to use that false sense of controversy, that false sense of there is actually a debate going on, to undermine teaching science in the classroom. And like I said, evolution and climate change has been a new front on these attempts to undermine science education. It's probably going to be gathering steam as the years progress. So it doesn't have that same history of creationism versus evolution, but I can guarantee as time goes on, it's going to be one of the more contentious issues that we're seeing play out in politics on the school level. It's going to be something that kids are going to be, that's going to be on the front lines of the science education battle. So that brings us to the new front, which is the Student Religious Liberties Bill. And so these bills, for the most, are being touted as a chance for students to be able to have voluntary religious expressions during the school day. So if they want to, have in a break, have a 15-minute Bible study or say a prayer at a graduation. But what's really troubling is this language that's being inserted. Students may express their beliefs about religion in homework, artwork, and other written and oral assignments free from discrimination based on the content of their submissions. So what these student religious liberties bills are in fact saying is, let's say you're in science and you're talking about evolution. A kid turns in his worksheet, says, I don't believe in evolution. God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Dinosaur bones were put here on earth by Satan to distract us. Even though it's not right, even though it's not the lesson the teacher has been giving, the student can't be penalized for just spouting religious dogma back at the teacher. The teacher can't say, look, that's one thing, but this is what we're talking about. We're talking about evolution. This is what the science says. They can't be penalized for saying, the student can't be penalized for using religion as an answer in the science classroom. And it's something that's really picked up steam in the last few years. It's part of the reason it started was a kid, I think, had actually done this, had used, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, a kid had used religion when answering his homework. The teacher had marked him wrong, and it blew up with the inevitable, they're attacking Christian values. So this has been introduced in various states so far. Alabama has one going through the legislature right now. Georgia and Oklahoma had theirs stall, but I assure you they're probably going to be coming back. And Mississippi and Missouri passed theirs. So this is something that is incredibly troubling because the language that these people are using to pass these laws is, we're protecting students' religious freedom. We're making it so that the government can't infringe on the right to freely worship. The problem becomes, what counts as religious expression? Is schoolwork actually a form of religious expression? What constitutes that? If, going back to earlier, if a teacher can be penalized for teaching creationism because that counts as religious advocacy, what happens when a student does it? And these are all sorts of problems that are going to be showing up further and further down the line that we don't know the answer to right now, because this is such a new form that these anti-science folks are using to attack science education and being used to undermine it. And it's not just science education, but also sex ed. What if, in very rare places, there's actually medically and scientifically accurate, comprehensive, evidence-based sex ed? What happens if the child didn't opt out or their parents didn't opt out for them and they use religion? What happens if they're reading something that the child or that the family has a religious objection to? There are all sorts of problems with these bills that I think are going to be detrimental to school districts because it's going to be an avenue for litigation further down the line. Like we've seen with all the creationist bill or attempts to stifle the teaching of evolution, these types of things inevitably come up in court. And so school districts right now, state education doesn't have the money to deal with this. So it's going to be a massive drain on their resources. And it's something that's particularly worrying. There we go. So Arkansas on this round. So what's happening in Arkansas's neighbors? I talked a little bit about what's happening in Arkansas. Right now in Texas, which is one of the major school textbook markets, and so a lot of times what happens in Texas will influence states all around it because because they buy so many textbooks, it's easier for other states to just adopt standards similar to Texas, to have textbooks similar to Texas with a few key things replaced. Texas currently requires teachers teach all sides of the evolution, intelligent design, and global warming debates to encourage critical thinking. Additionally, the Texas Education Agency has declared itself to be neutral on the subject of intelligent design. So while they don't support it, they aren't saying that thing's full of bullshit. Or sorry, there are small children here. That thing is full of baloney. Forget what I said earlier, small children. Secular children. And then there's the issue of charter schools. So right now, 20 charter schools belonging to the Responsive Education Solutions charter system, which is something that teaches creationism, are found within the states. And that's something that I didn't really talk about because charter schools are its own kettle of fish that could be its own hour-long talk with the pros, cons, debates, controversy surrounding them. But one of the big problems with charter schools is that sometimes they aren't being held to the same educational standards. So they can easily teach things like creationism, intelligent design, teaching the controversy, and encouraging students to be critical of these things. In Oklahoma, there are currently no laws on the books that support creationism or religiously motivated education policies. A number of bills have been proposed in recent years to do just that. All of them have failed, but in all likelihood there are going to be more. Right now, Oklahoma is currently the only state that had a bill introduced that celebrated conversion therapy. So there's that. So expect Oklahoma to have some more anti-science bills introduced in the future. In Kansas, while they do maintain a secular curricula, there have been a few attempts made to introduce creationists and other non-secular ideas. None of them have succeeded, but given that the governor of Kansas just did an executive order saying that it was perfectly all right for state employees to discriminate against LGBT individuals, if that bill reached his desk, I'm fairly sure he would sign it. Kansas has engaged in various reforms in the past couple of decades, however, in favor of secular education standards, and they have affirmed the validity of evolution through the adoption of the next generation science standards. But again, there will most likely be attempts made to undermine that. There was an attempt in Ohio to undermine that, and it was when they were striking out the language, they had the thing about teaching or encouraging students to engage in the various theories about controversial topics. So that could happen in Kansas fairly easily. In Missouri, students have the state education policy mandates that when taught, students must be provided with a critical assessment of evolution. There have been efforts to further weaken the state's educational policies about evolution, including bills designed to enable parents to opt out of any lessons that teach evolution. So because it's controversial, like sex ed, parents can opt out. In Kentucky, they have been using the phrase change over time instead of evolution in state science standards. This is, the state that has the Creationist Museum that recently asked for a fairly large incentive to help build its ark. And it also gave us Mitch McConnell. So it also permits the teaching of creationism alongside evolution in the schools. In Tennessee, a bill was passed that protected teachers who explore the scientific strengths and scientific weaknesses of evolution and climate change, as well as other controversial topics in science, such as cloning and the origins of life. In Mississippi, like I mentioned earlier, they did pass a Student Religious Liberties Act. They also allow teachers to provide contrarian viewpoints for issues like evolution and climate change. And there have been various pieces of legislation proposed that would restrict the teaching of evolution in schools completely. These bills, however, have consistently failed to pass, I think mainly because most people realize that would just be inviting the state, it would leave the state open to a lot of lawsuits. And in Louisiana, as I mentioned, there is the Louisiana Science Education Act, the darling of the Discovery Institute, which allows teachers to supplement evolution lessons with creationist lines of thoughts. Other topics, such as global warming, are also subject to supplemental criticism due to the contentious nature of the debates surrounding them. So as you can see, there are some good, some bad, a lot of cause for concern. Even if these bills aren't being passed and aren't being moved forward, the fact that they're still being introduced is still something to keep an eye out. It's still something that excuse me, its sponsors either believe that it has a chance of getting through, or they think that their constituents would appreciate these messaging types of bills. So what can you do? Because like I said, I don't want to leave you guys feeling bummed out because there's all sorts of attempts to undermine science education. One thing to do would be to reach out to the local Science Teachers Association. The Arkansas Science Teachers Association is affiliated with the national group. They do take a stand that evolution is the accepted scientific theory, that creationism should not be taught in public school classrooms. So reaching out to them, seeing what you can do to support science teachers, because remember, right now only 20% of science teachers are teaching evolution correctly. That 50% don't even bother teaching it because of the backlash. That 10%, or that the other 20% are teaching it incorrectly because they don't have the support, the materials that they need. So reaching out to the local Science Teachers Association and seeing what you can do in your community to help support the science teachers and let them know that they have support, that they have backup, that they aren't alone, and trying to make sure that science is being taught correctly. You want to make your voice heard. A lot of these policies, the teaching of creationism, they're being done at the school district level. They're being done with the school board enacting these policies, with the principals letting teachers know that, creationism is, if you want to teach creationism, I'll look the other way. So you need to make your voice heard on that level. You need to make sure that the school board knows that there are folks in the community who don't want teaching of creationism, the controversy, intelligent design, whatever their language they're using to cover up the fact that they're trying to get religious instruction in public schools. You want to be able to engage your schools, engage your school board, work with them to make sure that science is being taught correctly. If a bill is put forward by a legislator, let them know that there is a community out here who doesn't believe what they believe, who believes that science should be taught in the science classroom, not religion. There are a lot of different ways to be active, to be engaged, to make your voice heard. This isn't a losing battle. This is something that you can easily become involved in. If there are local science groups, local, excuse me, sorry, I've been talking and haven't been drinking water, and so that's starting to catch up to me. Just finding different allies in different communities, working with progressive religious communities. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my speech, there are groups out there who believe that science and their faith can be reconciled and that science is what should be taught in public schools. Working with them as allies. It's hard to do things alone, and so you need to find people who can help carry that burden. And there are those people in Arkansas. You just need to be able to find them and be able to work with them to make sure your voices are heard. That is it for my speech. And am I doing a Q&A now, or? Yeah, if there's time. Okay, so yeah, I can answer questions for folks for about the next 10 minutes if they're interested. If not, I will turn things back over to Mason and drink water to give my voice a rest. Yes? States, sorry, California has been doing a really good job. I'm not just saying that because I'm originally from California. Surprisingly, in terms of vaccines, Mississippi has been doing a good job. They're one of the only 2 states that doesn't have any form of non-medical exemption, and an attempt to get non-medical exemptions recently failed. So there is hope, guys. But what you're seeing is in states like Montana, for example, Montana had a bill introduced that was the critical thinking bill sponsored by the Discovery Institute. And it was tabled because there was vocal opposition to it. There were people who stood up and said, look, this isn't science. This is just you guys trying to get creationism back in the classroom where it doesn't belong. And so Montana did a good job of making sure that science stayed science. So that there are some success stories where people made their voices heard and were able to let the politicians know that these types of bills that the Discovery Institute is sponsoring aren't welcome.
Curious about the Discovery Institute. Do we know who the members are?
Not off the top of my head. I've visited their website. It's a little scary. But one of the people who I think has been very involved is a former UC Berkeley law professor who's been one of the big proponents of teaching intelligent design, creation science, what have you, in the classrooms. They're the ones who have the sample legislation to give the politicians who are interested in undermining teaching evolution. So they're one of the big groups behind it. They aren't the only group behind it. There's another organization or coalition, Cornwall, who's the second word of their name is escaping me right now. I'm sorry. I can talk with you later. But they're another group that has been using religion to deny and undermine evolution and climate change. I was looking at their website and they had an entire thing about why God gave us the earth and we can do with the earth what we like, including releasing lots of pollutants in the air, and it won't matter because in the end God will, destroy everything and the blessed will go to heaven and everyone else is going to die and burn. Yes?
There's a little loophole in Arkansas in science, but in any class, where if a teacher is asked a question by a student, they can give their own opinion. And so if you've got a science teacher that's leaning towards creationism, and they have a student in the class that's from the same church that says, well, what about the controversy? You hear the whole story without violating the law.
Yeah. Yes?
In Arkansas, there are no standards
this an issue that your organization also looks at?
We mainly look at, by cosmology, you mean like our place in the cosmos?
And development of
Okay. We do, like, along the same lines of why we take a stand with teaching of evolution, because with cosmology, although we're still figuring out what caused the universe, I think recent scientists have said, wait, there might not actually be a Big Bang. The universe might have always existed. So, like, scientists are right now, and I'm not just saying this to try and undermine scientific thought. There's one of my very good friends is studying the origins of the universe. So there is still, discussions among scientists about what is actually going on with cosmology, but saying that God created the universe, that's something that our organization would take a stand against, because, again, it's religion in public schools, which is essentially sponsoring religion, which does violate the Constitution. In the back, and then you. And then after that, one more question. Yes.
So you mentioned that one Texas that requires the teaching of creation. I'm curious if you have discovered that there has been any pushback from other than Christians. So, for example, you come in and you teach creationism, you're obviously talking about Christian creationism. There's a million creation myths out there. So, I'm curious, are you seeing pushback from, for example, Hindus going, no, that's not how creation happens. This is how creation happens.
Not that I've seen, but I wouldn't be surprised if, kind of along the lines of the Satanists taking advantage of the 10 Commandments being displayed on the Oklahoma Capitol, and the fact that in Orange County, Florida, groups could distribute Bibles. I could see other groups taking advantage of that fact. Other than the Satanists, I don't know if other groups have taken advantage of that to ask about their own creation myths. If they ask the teacher to explain, well, teacher, what about X? So we haven't seen it. That isn't to say it won't happen, because I'm sure there's going to be some group that, to undermine these laws or undermine these tacit understandings, that are going to take advantage of that. Yes?
I was just thinking about the one you were talking about, the student religious freedom thing.
Mhm.
What's come back from that? Are any teachers actually coming up saying, hey, kids are taking advantage of us because of this, and it's making it an issue in our district?
Not yet, but I can imagine that it will happen in the future. Right now, it's only been 2 states that have these laws, but if more and more states have them, I can see the ACLU finding test cases, kind of like what they did with Scopes, where they found Scopes and had them be their test case. Or someone like FFRF or American Atheist, someone finding a test case to work out the constitutionality in the courts.
I don't get it in a way, because you're talking about science. So to me, I'm not a teacher, but if you have a test in front of you, the teacher's not asking you your opinion on any of the subjects on there. Every question on there is asking you what this textbook says. So I don't even see how they're making that argument, because a science test isn't for your opinion. It's for what's in the book to see if you understood the material to take the test.
You would think that, but
I was just wondering if it's actually had any impact on anybody's.
not yet, but they just recently started picking up steam. Mississippi's passed last year, so if any litigation or any serious challenges to it would be happening within this year. With the red hair, and that's the last question. Sorry.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the charter schools actually affect this whole process? Because we actually have current legislation in Arkansas, HB 1733, to promote more charter schools to be imposed very easily in Arkansas.
Sure. So for some charter schools, it isn't a problem. They're run by the public school district. It's a way for them to try out different learning methods that might be group work, technology-based, or arts and music-based. So finding something that might better fit the needs of individual students, that's fine. What becomes a problem is when religious organizations or like community organizations that do value creationism are the ones forming these groups, and they aren't held to the same standard, the school board standards, because they are viewed as these being able to take more educational risks, being able to do different things within the educational system. And so the Responsive Education Solutions, I think that was the name, in Texas is an example of a group. Responsive Education Solutions is a group that does, use the charter school system to advocate or to advance creationism in the science classrooms. So that is SCA's policy is, for the most part, charter schools, we don't take a stand on them, but when they're being funded, being pushed forward by these religious groups, or they receive public money, that's something that is a cause for concern, does violate the First Amendment, specifically the Establishment Clause, because the government shouldn't be giving money to churches, shouldn't be subsidizing someone's religious education. And so I'm not fully an expert on charter schools. We do work with the Coalition for Public Education, which does more work with charter schools and vouchers. And so they would be someone to ask about what's going on with charter schools and how does charter schools and expanding them impact science education. Anne?
Yeah, even though, sorry, your last question, there's already been a bill introduced this week to do away with the next generation science standards here in Arkansas. We're one of the 26 states that help formulate those new science standards. So that's a problem in and of itself. That bill should be coming up in committee next week. So if anybody wants to hang out to the Capitol and hang out with me, that's something you can do.
Yeah, and like Anne said, when things are coming up in committee, that's one of the best ways to make your voice heard, because sometimes they will ask for public comment, and it's very short, but it's a good way to get yourself on the record, to talk to the committee members, even if some of them are so set in their ways they aren't going to change their mind. You're letting them know that there are members in the community who do have an opinion, who can make, and you can make your voice heard that way. If folks are interested in learning more about directly affecting what's going on here in Little Rock, feel free to come up to me. I'm tabling outside. We're working on starting up a chapter for Arkansas to do state level lobbying to take a stand on things like getting rid of the next generation science standards, which do advocate for the teaching of evolution, making sure that the 10 Commandments don't have a place by the State House here in Little Rock. So making sure that that voucher money isn't going to religious schools. All of those things are items that we work on. I can talk with you a little bit more about what we've been doing in other states. I can give you the contact information for our legislative associate, Sarah, who's going to be taking on the state chapters and moving them forward. So there's a lot of stuff to be done. Like I said, I'm tabling outside. Feel free to come up and talk to me after this. So thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a great rest of the conference.